Hi everybody, my name is Mattia Chiappa, I hope you're doing well, and welcome to the fourth episode of this 10 Orchestration Techniques series. I'm really excited about this. What I'm going to do throughout the video is breaking down 10 more orchestration examples I've prepared for you, using the same melody, reharmonized and sometimes revoiced to better fit the context of the music. For those of you who are new to the series, don't worry, these episodes don't have to be watched in any particular order, but before we jump in with number 31, I will very quickly remind everybody with the melody we have been using throughout the series. As usual, we start with something nice and simple and we'll gradually build the complexity as we go. So here's number 31. All right. As we said, this is super simple, but I think it works pretty well. We only really have a couple of different parts going on. Woodwinds on the melody and high strings on those Lydian chords bed. The chords are only made of 4 voices. That makes it extra easy to split them within the string section, essentially having each instrument taking one note, with violins on the top and violas and cellos on the bottom. Here's a fun little thing. It's not particularly relevant to this example, but I will show you anyway. It doesn't really make any difference virtually, but if you were to do this live, you could experiment using Divisi for achieving a wider sound. It works best with bigger chords, but it may be something worth investigating here as well. I first came across this technique with Bernard Herrmann's score for Psycho. As you can see, he's dividing the notes in such a way that leaves a chord tone gap in between instruments, creating a very interesting stereo spread across the scoring stage. Anyways, getting back to our example, in the percussion section we have a harp playing chords with a technique called bisbigliando, which is basically a tremolo, and we have trills on triangle as well. The reason behind this layer was essentially adding a little bit extra movement to the accompaniment, and another viable option could have been using strings tremolando, but I wanted something a little bit more subtle than that. For the melody we have clarinet, English horn and bassoon doubling each other on the same lower register, but also flute an octave higher. Either clarinet, English horn or bassoon would have worked great on their own with no doubling whatsoever, but for this particular example I wanted a thicker horn-like kind of sound, but without making use of the French horn just yet. Again, going back to percussion, for glue we have a very gentle cymbal swell at the beginning and end, and to accent the very last chord I've used harp playing a Lydian arpeggio. So let's play the whole thing again and then I'll show you the next one. Number 32. The idea behind this was splitting the melody in 3 different phrases, acting like 3 separate counterlines, and of course I started from piano and orchestrated according to what I played. The first line was in a good register for clarinets, the second was good for trumpet, which I also doubled on oboe and violin 1, and finally French horns, violins 2 tremolo, and woodwinds harmonizing the last 3 notes in triads. Strings very quickly take on the accompaniment role from the second bar, and as usual we have a tuned percussion for accents but also basses playing pizzicato very briefly. As I said, these first 2 examples are made to demonstrate a couple of simple little concepts and how to apply them to the orchestra. We're going to move on to something a little bit more case specific from now on, but let's first play this example again from the top. We are now in a 6/8 triplet bass time signature, and of course the theme is now in a minor key, D minor to be more precise.
I like writing in D.
The most important elements are the melody, now taken by violin 1 and English horn, but also these minor arpeggios being passed from clarinets to flutes, while we have piano in the background for glue and glockenspiel doubling the flutes. Mirroring the woodwinds, we have a line on violas that follows the shape of those arpeggios, but rather than legato, we have a succession of short notes to further reinforce the sense of rhythm. Similarly, the harmony started to sound a little bit vague at this point, so I've used some pad-like chords on French horns and violin 2, and low string spits on the tonic of the chords. The example ends with a really wide G minor flat 13 arpeggio and a big swell on brass and percussion. Here's the strings in isolation. Here's the woods. And let's take it from the top. Okay, so 34 and 35 will be similar in some ways, because what I was trying to accomplish here was a couple of action-like cues on 2 different intensity levels. My goal for this was creating tension with low dynamics and not too much stuff going on at the same time. And the way I approached this was essentially creating a few different layers of ostinati, focusing on the lower register of the orchestra. On top of that bed of cellos, we have violas and clarinets. While bassoon and bass clarinet have yet again a different line that hits some of the most important cello notes. And all this sits on an extra layer of bass and percussion with piano, timpani and bass drum. In terms of harmony, pretty much anything except for the cellos is based on the diminished scale, which is great for creating tense sounding textures. The melody is split between the French horns first, then trumpets, xylophone and violins on the second half of the phrase, creating, together with French horns, some dissonant sounding polychords. The melody ends with a big swell, and for that I've used low brass and timpani, but also harp and woodwinds running up the diminished scale to further boost the building dynamics. That's it, let's play it again from the top. Again, this is basically just me trying to further develop the previous example into something similar yet different. So I'm pretty much making use of the same elements, same harmonic language with dissonance and all that, but repackaged in a slightly different way. Aside from orchestration, the most striking difference is probably that this is faster and dynamics are higher. And the reason is I wanted to increase the overall intensity level, and that was my very first idea on how. On that note, I think this actually feels faster than it actually is. And that was very simply achieved by doubling the speed of the basses from half notes to quarter notes. We still have the very same ostinatos, but they moved higher in register with violins, and the second part is now on trumpets and violas. I've given the melody to cellos and trombones for the first half, but on the second half I wanted to use trumpets that we know are busy playing the rhythm. It wouldn't really make any sense for this context to entirely drop that part, so I made sure to save the woodwinds in order to be able to swap roles with trumpets without making this change sound too abrupt. Here, trombones and tuba are also moving to a quarter note rhythm together with bass and cello for extra tension. Okay, let's play the whole thing. I promise for the next one we're gonna dial it down a little bit. Alright, this is quite clearly quoting Danny Elfman's score for Edward Scissorhands. It might be a little bit of a stretch, but I absolutely love that score, and I actually wanted to feature it from the very first episode because it has such a unique sound and I was hugely inspired by it. I mean, it doesn't necessarily show up in my music very much, but it is something I'm oftentimes going back to when I'm looking to be inspired. Of course, I repackaged it my own way, but I really can't hide where this came from. Probably more so than any other examples I've shown you so far. Anyways, when talking about this example, I should probably start from the harmony. A signature part of this sound is the use of the melodic minor scale. I don't want to go too deep in the theory of it, but I think it's always a very interesting harmonic choice for drama because it both shares the characteristics of the minor scale, having the flattened third, and the major scale for the second half, with the major 7th and 6th. We are going to take a closer look to the orchestration in a second, but let me first play a piano-reduced version. So we have a couple of bars of introduction with the focus on Celeste. When using Celeste, you always have the option of doubling with Glockenspiel if you want to amplify those overtones and make it ring even more, like I do here. We also have arpeggios running down the scale with violas, cellos and clarinets, and a downward harp gliss. We have a small swell on basses, low brass, timpani, and a suspended cymbal. Violins are playing tremolo on the high register the whole time. And the melody is now taken by oboe and female choir, with the last few notes in a 6-part harmony with French horns, flutes and clarinets. The rest of the string section is playing pizzicato doubled by Celeste and Glockenspiel, and that functions both as accompaniment as counterpoint to the main melody. We have tuba and trombones to reinforce the harmony with a simpler rhythm, and triangle accenting beat 2. And lastly, I want to show you this quick arpeggio on flutes and clarinets. Let's take it from the top. Number 37. Before we talk about the orchestration for this, I first want to show you what is going on harmonically, because this is slightly more complex than the previous examples. The whole idea behind this was using drop 2 voicings on strings to create this lush retro sound. I'll explain in a few words what that is for those of you who are not familiar with the concept. We basically start with these closely voiced extended chords, and we move the second note from the top down an octave on the lower instrument, cellos in this case. And this particular technique is used a lot in jazz, but of course it can have many other uses as well. With that in mind, let's have a listen to the strings. I've also doubled the top line on oboe just to give it a little bit of extra help. With this kind of dense parts writing, it's always a good idea to keep a close eye to your main melodic line and double it with something else just to make sure it doesn't get lost. Down in the bottom register, we have big open chords with basses, bassoons, and clarinets, and harp gently arpeggiating the chords. Flutes and French horns have a couple of answer phrases and fill out the harmony on the last 2 chords. And finally, we end with a trill on flutes and this line of Celeste. Okay, harmonically, this is actually really simple with a fairly standard chord progression. On top of that, we have these stacked fourths ostinato split between violins on the higher voices and violas on the lower. But I've also used tuned percussion such as xylophone and piano on both voices to glue the strings, and glockenspiel doubling the violins. Let's take a listen to that. We have cellos, low woodwinds and bass pits in the bottom register playing some short notes. The melody is now taken by French horns, building in triads with trumpets and strings on the last bar. For that last bar, I've also used the rest of the brass with low strings and widths, all contributing to the big crescendo using the same rhythm. And of course, the build-up would not be complete without percussion and a woodwind run. Finally, we end with some stabs on low strings, brass, widths, timpani and bass drum. We're almost done, 39. I think this sounds more complex than it really is. What I'm basically trying to do here is stacking different augmented chords on top of each other. Again, I don't want to go into too much detail with the theory behind it, but I think some degree of explanation is actually necessary for this. So, due to the nature of augmented chords, which are basically made of stacked major thirds, each inversion of the same chord is built in with the very same interval relationships, making it only possible to have a total of 4 augmented chords: C, C sharp, D and E flat. This is indeed disputable because as a matter of fact we do have 8 remaining chords, but because of their symmetric nature they can also be interpreted as inversions of each other and the previous. For example, if we take a closer look to a C augmented in first inversion, you can very well see how similar that looks to an E but also an A flat augmented respectively in second and third inversions.
Interesting.
So while this may be a fun trivia fact and all, what's actually more important is how this sounds like, obviously, and the different flavor each inversion has, particularly when you mix them up with each other and with different chords, essentially creating this rich tapestry of parallel harmony. getting back to our orchestration, the main melody is getting passed from flutes to oboe and then bassoons. Violins are playing harmonics into octaves on a really high E pedal tone. And the rest of the woods are basically doing what I described before, moving between different augmented chords in different registers, starting with clarinets, then flutes, and then all together with bassoons. At the very end, I'm using the high E pedal tone as a pivot point to create tension and then resolve to an E major chord. We also have a couple of embellishments here and there on Celeste, and strings and harp on the last chord. Cool, let's play it again from the top and then I'll show you the last one. I think this might be my favorite one so far, mostly because I had an excuse to play guitar, which I rarely get to do these days. So the ensemble I've used here is more like a studio orchestra rather than the big symphonic stuff I usually do. We have on the accompaniment some string spits, tuba and trombones. This is the very first time I'm using a drum kit and acoustic guitars, as I mentioned before. The melody is now being played in harmony by clarinets, guitars and piano, with some accented notes on our trusty glockenspiel. And finally, the example ends with multiple voices happening at the same time. Here's what strings and brass sound like. Here's the piano. And guitars. All right, let's play the whole thing again. I have to be honest, it's progressively getting harder for me to make these videos without starting to bend the melody from what it used to be. But I keep going as long as I will have ideas. I still have a couple of basic ones I haven't touched just yet, but apart from that, we'll probably have to start going into more specific examples very soon. I mean, just like a few of the ones we talked about today. Anyways, as always, make sure to like the video and subscribe. It may not look like it, but these contents really do take forever to put together. And if you feel like supporting me, of course, check out my Patreon page. It's linked in the description below. I share with my patrons all sorts of extra educational resources, including the files and scores for this project. That being said, I really hope you enjoyed the video. Thank you very much for watching, and see you very soon. Bye.